morning, and thank you for joining Unleashing Success in Q3, Insights in Back to School, Economic Impact, Segment Revival, and Retail Resilience with Ethan Chernofsky, VP Marketing at Placer.ai. As a reminder, if you have any questions during the conversation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're very grateful to have you with us. And, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, your evening, once again, thank you for spending time with us. So Ethan, to get ready for today, I walked around the reservoir 3 times last night, got a little bit of rain, a little bit of sun, and I was with a very well-known reporter. And so we were talking about, we were kind of asking each other a lot of questions, which I know you're going to have answers to today. So we may throw you some curveballs, but I know you do best that way. That kind of like is what lights you up. But we talked about, right, kind of back to school, right? What's going to happen with the potential changes in, what people expect around some of these student loan payments. We've already had some of the SNAP unwinding, and, I'd say inflation has been, honestly, for me, it's lower than where I would have expected it. So I think that's a real positive. And also understanding in an era of, really unexpected organized retail crime numbers, what does that mean for physical retail, and any guidance you have? Because we're seeing a lot of guidance around partnerships between kind of the retailers and the landlords. And that has been, I think, one of the ways that's kind of worked. So I'm gonna lay that as our plate right now. So back to school, holiday, ORC, looking a little bit at the macro, and what does that actually mean for physical retail? And then what kind of advice do you have as you kind of like dig deep into the data for the rest of this year? So with that, Ethan, I'm kicking it over to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about some of the things that we're hearing about the most as well. And I think a lot of these are like the big topics. And some of these are, to get transparently, some of these are more or less kind of influenced by the perspectives that our data can bring. But I do think, kind of a long segue into kind of what is our data for those of you who are kind of less familiar with Placer or unfamiliar. We're a location data company. What does that mean? People vote with their feet. We show you how they vote across the United States every single day. We do that by observing a panel of tens of millions of devices. Very critically, is de-identified aggregate data. So we are GDPR and CCPA compliant, and we then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms and kind of present it in a wealth of different reports within our platform. So everything from cross-visitation, customer journeys, true trade areas, benchmarking, visit counts, and a whole lot more, all within our platform. And I think that is the kind of nice little segue into where you kicked us off, Deborah, which is kind of like the inflation. But I do think it's, I'm always hesitant to say like inflation as like the headline, just because I think there's so much to it, and there's all these other elements that are part of it. So last year was kind of like the drying up of stimulus, and there's always the elements of like kind of the pull forward of demand. And what I think is really interesting for me from that conversation is what's lasting and what's not, because I do think that, look, there are challenges that are temporary, and they're challenging, and it's really difficult, and it's important to be cognizant of that. But I do think these are short-term challenges. But I think there are behaviors that have the potential to be impacted over the long term because of what we're facing right now. So, if you think about someone delaying a purchase because they think this is something they can, a cost they can push off a little bit later into the year or into next year, you're not worried about the fundamental change in demand, right? You think it's something that's short-term, it's going to be difficult. Can we kind of batten down the hatches or figure out a short-term solution to get through this period? But there are elements that I think speak to longer-term challenges. So for example, trading down, right? And we've talked about this. If I went from kind of grocery store X and now I'm loving my Lidl or Aldi experience, and even if I shift not all of my grocery behavior, but part of my grocery behavior somewhere else, does that have a long-term impact on my shopping patterns? I now go to Dollar General for certain elements. Do I continue doing that kind of post? Like, I think that's where things are interesting of what are the long-term shifts we see because of the short-term challenges. And when we look at that, things like kind of the pull forward of demand or kind of delaying these purchases are less worrying. But I think trading down is this potential shift where it's not going to be a sea change or this 180, but it could mean that there are brands that grab more visit share than they would have without this.
I mean, on the food inflation side, it's interesting, right? Because as you listen to the CPG's earnings and we spend time with them, they are, I think going back to, I would have thought based on my conversations with them that food inflation would be higher because they're finding the ability to pass through, well, not only real costs, but they're able to get higher prices, I think, than they had ever expected. And so that I think is, some of this is, that, there's part of this is structural, a lot of this is dynamic. And I think that if needed, we could see certainly, food inflation at different rates. But for now, right, they're not seeing huge volume changes, et cetera. So I mean, if people are willing to, there are, without calling out specific retailers or brands, right? Some people are like, we've been surprised, right? Like how high we can, like how high is high, right? And I think that that's something to think about as well in terms of what's ultimately driving some of this. So yes, it would show that there is inflation. Like I said, it's less than I would have expected based on my conversations, but also some of this is not structural and can be, let's just say it can abate quickly if needed.
Yeah, it's a super interesting point.
So this is we talked about this before the call started in terms of kind of, I don't know, do we want to call it omni? Do we kind of call it unified? Do we like, what, Ethan, we can talk for an hour on this whole topic, right? Between online and offline, and in online, do we want to put like metaverse and live streaming and all these other potentially new channels there? How do you, I'm hearing, so this is really interesting, from many retailers that they have been surprised at how the customer journey has changed. Some of that is actually retail media driven and some of the incentives that they're getting, which I think is fascinating, right? We're starting to see this like whole gamification angle, right? Like if I do this in store, I can then get, my favorite is because, I do like, I won't call it any brands, but there is one candy bar that like, that will probably get me to change my behavior. And so, if you kind of follow this path to purchase, we'll give you a free candy bar. And what we're seeing, right, is real changes in behavior driven by, kind of retail media, which I know is something you focus very much on.
So I think what's interesting about the retail media conversation is like you said, I think it gives us these we have a lot to learn from the path to omni, harmonize it, again, whatever you want to call it, that can be applied to our understanding of what's going on with retail media, specifically within the physical environment. Because I think kind of the online expectation of what this provides is fairly well trodden and understood. Now, I think there are growing challenges. I think there are the issues that we know exist with search-based advertising, no matter where it exists. I mean, there's a lot of research as a marketer. This is obviously something that specifically has always interested me, of like how much of it is just the natural organic process that would have existed. But I think it's a kind of conversation for another time. On the physical side, I think there's been this interesting pushback because a lot of people are asking like, well, is this new? This has already existed. The short answer is, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like retail, the idea of a brand can promote themselves within a store that they're selling in is not something that's new, right? This has already existed. I think what's happening now, though, is a confluence of several factors that's making it more palatable and more exciting, and that's what's driving this buzz. So one is kind of the technology that's enabling it. So everyone from like cooler screens to grocery TV to all these kind of brands in between that have technologies that enable this more exciting in-store experience. I think a second thing is this kind of growing appetite. And by appetite, it's a recognition from retailers of why this is interesting, and from advertisers, whether non-endemic or endemic, why there's something exciting going on. And I think that's the value of the discovery process itself and the value of the visit. So when I'm in a store, I'm in a different mindset than when I'm online, right? When I'm online, there's more of a convenience orientation, a speed, get this done. When I am in a store, I'm a little bit more willing to be distracted or guided into something different. I think the last bit is the measurability. So the more we advance in how we can measure what's happening in the physical world, the more we can align that measurement with other elements, understand our wider marketing mix and where this fits in within that. But I do think there's this element of recognizing that we are in early stages of this next wave of development for retail media. And it does parallel Omni for me, Omni, Harmonize, again, whatever you want to call it, because also Omni isn't new, right? We've been talking about Omni for decades, but how many retailers do we really think are nailing Omni in the way we envisioned it 10 years ago, let alone, 5 years ago? So I think we have all of these levels to go in terms of how these things evolve, but they do kind of tend to get these kind of kicks forward from things that are happening in terms of our shifts in behavior, being driven by changes in the wider retail engagement because of things like the pandemic, things like inflation, and the learnings that we've had as a result.
So we got a question from the audience. So Rich, thank you. And the question is, aren't retailers simply grabbing additional gross margin from their vendors, as I don't see any non-vendors selling in those stores like automobile companies selling in these stores? What do you think, Ethan?
I think the answer to that is almost unequivocally no. Like, we are seeing, interestingly, when we talk to a lot, there are obviously endemic advertisers. There is a lot of non-endemic. And interestingly enough, when we talk to kind of technology companies that are selling within, especially those who they are partnering with the retailer, so they have the space, but it's their job to go and sell that advertising space, and then the retailer gets a cut. They are seeing more traction in many cases from non-endemic than they are from endemic. Now, I think that's interesting because I would have expected the opposite, to be honest with you. But I think it shows that there is an appetite to engage within those environments, and there are those who are understanding that the opportunity exists. I actually think the bigger question is, when does the endemic advertising start to up level within these channels?
What's your thought?
I mean, to be honest with you, I think it's just, there's going to be a turning point at some stage, because I do think it was very strange for me when we saw how engaged, or the more we talked to folks and we understood that non-endemic was playing a bigger role than they had expected. So I think it's just a question of who kind of takes that first step to say, all right, we're going to embrace this and then drive it as part of our wider, whether it's part of their category management process or part of a wider marketing advertising strategy. I think that's going to be decided, but there is a lot of room for endemic advertising to leverage these channels more effectively.
And then it's an interesting point, and is retail media the catalyst in terms of how these, I think more multi than mono brand companies think about this conversation?
I think it's a lot of it's just, it's new. It's a newer channel in the sense that, okay, I was operating from a retail media perspective, working directly through the retailer. So the relationship was category management through that merchandising, and then understanding the kind of promotions as part of that. There's a new player in the mix, which is this kind of third-party technology or vendor of some kind. That's bringing a new piece in. And so it is something that a lot of those mechanics still haven't been figured out for yet.
So do you think this is left pocket, right pocket, or more than that?
I think it's the beginning of an evolution. I think the retail media, the challenge that we tend to have, and we have conversations about this, we sit on two sides. One, there's this tremendous excitement of, oh my God, this is world changing, or this isn't new at all. And I think both are probably exaggerated. So I do think this is something that's existed, but I think it's seeing a really important evolution. And over the next few years, it will level out. So it's not every retailer is going to have an advertising network too, but there is going to be a growing recognition of the advertising potential of the in-store experience.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as you think about kind of this new normal, how does this kind of play out, and what is kind of timing, going back to how long term will they be? What do you think?
I have been, my expectation of this has been wrong several times. So I add that in as the very important grain of salt.
Caveat.
Yeah, really a big one, right? But I think what's been fascinating when we think about office, the things that are driving office trends and the things that are driving migration shifts, we have many, many indications that these are very rational choices, right? So in many cases, we see the shift of migration from places of higher income to lower income, higher chances of being a home renter to higher chances of being a home owner, higher cost of living to lower cost of living. With office, we see that areas with a higher uptick back to the office generally tend to have lower households, so like smaller households. So I'm less likely to have kids, right? Which is a very, I am a professional. I'm in the office right now. I come in a few days a week. I have a few children at home, and that is a big piece of why I don't come in as often as I might otherwise. The rationality behind the decision indicates that those who are making it have a real reason to, and therefore it's not just as quick as, hey, the company wants you back, therefore come back. It is going to be this push and pull. Do I think it's going to be? I think what we're seeing now is a good indication of what's likely to come, which is virtual work is here. It is a significant piece of the puzzle. It doesn't mean that the level of virtual work that we are seeing will be the level it will be 5 years from now, but it will be hard to pull back all of that shift. And so we are likely going to see this hybrid scenario stay in the future because it works in the benefit of those who are taking advantage. So the question is, can we find a new win-win? And once that win-win is found, where do retailers and restaurant chains fit within that? How do they maximize the opportunity? Because in some cases, there are really significant challenges. In others, though, I think there's huge opportunity, and it's who's going to move to incentivize those shifts in behavior.
I mean, I will. So I'm going to take this one because this is coming up in almost every conversation right now. I mean, so number one, do we end up with from a commercial perspective, the office space, do we end up with a crisis on our hands as people try to give the keys back, but nobody wants to take them? Number two, what happens to those restaurants and retailers who've kind of built up, either it's an urban strategy or if it's an office worker strategy, which I've been in many of those conversations over time. And then number three, right? What happens to this space, right? I live in New York City. I go to the office. There are not many people in our entire building, which is, over 20 floors. And so, this idea, even, the data shows, right, in major urban cities, you're kind of talking around, I think it's just south of 50% go in at all. So it can be someone who's going in 1 day a week, or, I think very few are going in 5. But I think there's a longer term, and once again, we probably don't have enough time to dig into it, but I'd like to at least scratch the surface. What does this mean for the restaurants and the retailers? And without your mayor saying, hey, get out there, go to the office, buy a drink along the way and a t-shirt, right? How do we start to kind of, for those businesses who are still left in these areas, how do we ensure that they are healthy and that they have the traffic that they need?
I mean, I think it's a flexibility question. I don't think, I think if you look at cities that we're seeing metrics that are better. So take New York City, where we're seeing things about 30% down of what it was in terms of overall visits. We see the bulk of those visits coming back in kind of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, midweek, and the kind of Monday and Friday getting hit the hardest in terms of where they were pre-pandemic. When we think about that recovery, I don't know that it's going to be, it's not, I don't think 5 days a week is going to be at the levels we saw pre-pandemic is coming back. And if it comes back, it's not coming back in the next year or two. And therefore, how do you flexibly adjust is going to be key. There are elements, though, that can be utilized to help offset that challenge. So for example, we know that areas where there are, areas in cities that are oriented towards residential, in many cases are seeing better scenarios for restaurants and for retail than they did pre-pandemic because people are around. I think the question is there a path forward to adjust, to figure out some elements of the model to be more efficient, to focus on hours? It's a question that each business is going to ask, but I do think we are closer to the new normal than if it was more of a question of, hey, are we going to get back to 90% of what it was? I think the answer is no, I don't think we will. I think it's that 3 to 4 days a week is likely the point where we're going to see, at least for the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now we're seeing, this is probably of any, right, any closed door forum I'm part of, this is amongst executives, the kind of hot potato question, because do you risk losing employees if you're requiring them to come back to office, right, to come back to the office? And that I think is something that, there is a fear of. And then also too, how can you are very flexible on geography, let's say over the last 3 years, and now all of a sudden, right, you've got people in 50 of the 50 states, which I know many retailers and brands and, do. How do you start to how does that kind of reverse migration work? So I think we're scratching the surface, but I think it's definitely the kind of hot potato topic. So that I think will, but I mean, hey, you talked about it, right? There are new opportunities, right? I mean, you look at mall traffic, right? I mean, the hours that people are going to the malls have completely changed. And, we're using malls in different ways than we have before. So, I mean, you used to see a lot of kind of post work day, and now you're seeing kind of during the work day, because you can talk on the phone, you can be on a Zoom, and you can be walking the mall. I mean, that's the truth of our new normal, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think one of the big things that really triggered this was we were at the end of last year, one of our big kind of things was our bullishness on the mall, and especially top tier malls. So I don't want to, obviously there's many that are struggling, but we look at top tier malls. What do we think? And we were very bullish about the space. And the thesis was essentially centered around the idea that there's this increasing diversity of tenant types, medical, retail, fitness, more restaurants, more experiences, et cetera. They were getting more experience oriented. There was this longer long tail within retail. So you think all these digitally natives who are now kind of testing out what offline retail means for them. And then you compare that with some of the challenges we've seen, right? So not only do we see visit gaps, but we see visit gaps largely increasing compared, year over year. We do know that visit duration is up, but we also know that malls that were closer to their audience, who have a smaller true trade area, tend to correlate better with higher visits than those with a larger true trade area. So that distance to travel was something that was an impediment to mall success. And so we were kind of grappling with what are the challenges that we're seeing, and does this change that kind of central thesis that malls have this unique opportunity? I think the answer is no. I think we feel just as optimistic about malls as we did before because of all those reasons. And I think you mentioned others that are part of it. If we are more flexible with our time, you can, especially if you live nearby, go to a mall, get breakfast in the morning, have a cup of coffee, do work for a few hours, just as a change of pace. If you have something you want to pick up in the middle of the day, you have that flexibility to do so. And I think for many professionals, flexibility is the biggest thing that hybrid work has provided. And so anyone who can orient themselves around these shifting patterns, to me, gets an ongoing benefit. So when we think about the underlying values that many of these top tier malls have already been embracing, the decisions that they've made as a result, and the shifts we've seen in the wider market, it doesn't change that central expectation that these top tier malls are going to be incredibly well positioned for the coming years.
Well, I mean, they're like over 100% leased. So, I mean, it's they're trying to find find additional space that they don't have, because I think that you are seeing these trips aggregated into, I think, fewer, better malls, and better could just be location. But that, I think, is what's so interesting right now, is kind of what's driving traffic, the hours that we're seeing in the traffic, and how much does co-tenancy come into this, et cetera, right? The rules of the past are definitely different than what we're seeing kind of now on a go forward basis. And that, I think, is, also a piece of this. And, the interest around, some of these kind of digitally native companies who are, very much looking to go into the physical realm with, kind of the whole 1P versus 3P, and the cost of, customer acquisition, or their CACs. I mean, that, I think, is providing for some very interesting dynamics for these top malls.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I just think you have so many things that are working in their favor, and those things haven't changed. So even in a difficult, and just because, again, we talked about this at the top, there are things that are challenging environments for a short-term period, and there are things that are a challenging environment for the longer term. It just appears that this is one of those, that this is a short-term challenge, and when we see things bounce back, we'll see continued growth there. And I think their underlying strength, as you mentioned, there's not enough space for them to lease. More people want to come in than they have space available. I think that obviously is kind of the key sign of what's to come.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I like this flexible consumer. Maybe we'll call it an agile consumer. And, the we're seeing a lot. I mean, I will tell you the interesting thing is that I would not have expected the beginning of the year, the word we heard most often was personalization, which I think then turned into like a loyalty discussion. And, what we're seeing now, right, is many retailers are penalizing you almost if you don't have their loyalty program, which is not the direction I would have expected things to go. And that I think is, I mean, we're hearing more and more about that. And, I think for any retailers or, kind of mall owners, I mean, the idea is, right, you want to bring people into your community for, kind of intangible and tangible benefits that they get. You don't want to penalize them for not being a part of that. And so I think that is where we're starting to see, going back to this flexible consumer and flexible kind of retail partner, this idea that, yes, we want to be flexible within a framework, but we also want to make sure that we think about the kind of foundation of just good business and, rewarding people for being loyal to you, I think is kind of what people expect. Penalizing you for not having signed up for your loyalty program, not what people expect. And so I think there is a change in the rules right now. And I think it's leading to maybe some inflexibility.
It's such an interesting point, because I think you're kind of dead on with, there is a shift in our recognition of where there is too much friction. So I think pre-pandemic, this idea that, the customer is always right and convenience is kind of the king, and whatever the customer wants, wherever they want it. I think that's changed, and I think that's a good thing. So for example, we've seen times where retailers, and think about the holiday season in 21, retailers very aggressively communicating, shop early. I'm not going to have what you want if you come too late in the season, or I don't know if I'll have what you want. Please come early. And shoppers responded and did. And there was kind of this identification of a win-win for the retailer and for the consumer. But that's the key. It's got to be a win-win. And if you increase the friction too much, that's off-putting and has a long-term negative. So a loyalty program is intended to be, here is a benefit for sticking with us in the long term, not here's a cudgel. And so I agree with you that if it becomes this, if the friction goes up too much, it becomes a real problem for the consumer from a long-term perspective. But I do think what's interesting here is this recognition of the identification of a win-win, even if that means slight drops in convenience or declines in elements that the customer might naturally want. That's not the end of the world. So I think we're redefining where that kind of Venn area is that overlaps between what the consumer wants and what the retailer wants. Does that mean that some people are going to go too far one way or another? Yeah, I think absolutely. But I think overall, we are seeing a redefinition, and that's a very good thing.
So we have a few questions in the chat. One I got so caught up in our conversation, Ethan, so we have to rewind a little bit. But it's an interesting question, and maybe a little bit outside the realm of, kind of what we're talking about, but I think it's something we should bring up. And, so we got a question from Rich. Why not make these employees become 1099 contractors? Because that is all that they are. Stop the benefits of those that are part of the team. I think this just illustrates the friction that we're seeing, kind of office, non-office, kind of remote. How do you, because these are the kind of closed door conversations I've been a part of. This hits to the heart of it. I mean, you often are counseling people in your role. How do you help them think through, right? If someone has, has left the state, you're calling people back to the office. How do you start to think through some of these very complicated conversations, and where do you start?
Look, I mean, we're a global company. We have offices in 2 countries, and we're distributed in the US. The decision for us was, we felt like we want to hire people wherever they are. We want to hire the best possible people who fit our culture. And we, if you want to, if that person's in New Hampshire, or if that person's in Chicago or Austin, we don't want to have to make a choice between them because of an office. Right? That was a clear decision. Now that creates its own challenges. How do we ensure we have kind of collaboration between team members, et cetera? So every decision you make has benefits and has negatives. I think the core, though, is who are the people you need to succeed? Because if you're building around the talent, the culture that you need, you're going to get the desired result. I think that like with retailer and consumer and identifying how do you find that win-win and where's that give and take, it's the same thing with employers and employees. If there are employers that might try to make people contractors, and I think they might see an exodus, and there's others that it might work for, but it really is being a little bit more kind of foundational and asking, how much am I dependent on this talent base? Because the more dependent I am, the more flexible I'm going to want to be. By the way, very often it works both ways. So the flexibility that you're able to provide allows you the ability to demand certain flexibilities too. So I think it's a new world in that regard, but there are ways to navigate it where it actually helps you in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, flexibility is a skill to develop just like everything else. All right, so we have a question from Christina. Do you think that suburban towns continue to expand their offering in retailers, restaurants, et cetera, versus people going downtown in big cities to shop and eat? Good question.
I hope I don't know if it's about expansion for me as much as do the retailers that are brought there make sense, as opposed to do things make sense where they are. So I'll give you an example about what I mean. There's a couple of digitally native brands that I absolutely love. And I am an older millennial. I think they're great. I love their branding. I love the way they market. I love their products. As someone who was a city dweller and then moved to the suburbs, and likely a big part of this brand's audience did the same, I would think that retailer is now more interested in the suburbs than they were before. There are other retailers that should be looking at the urban environment with their eyes wide open and saying, oh my gosh, my audience is there. This is a great opportunity for me. So I think it's about, do the shifts make sense? It's not, the suburbs aren't right for everybody and the city isn't right for everybody. It's about where your audience is, region by region. And some of this is suburb versus city, and some of this is shifts in where certain audience have moved because they've left to new areas entirely. So I think whenever there is a change, the decision that a retailer makes should be based on their audience, not on the presence, a binary decision on the presence of a wider trend.
I mean, these I think are the questions that, especially I know Christina well, and she has an amazing product. I think if she's trying to think through where to sell and where to take out a lease, and a whole other conversation around like length of lease terms, right? Because these are the real world conversations and questions that retailers and brands are going through. All right, back to school. We're just kicking off our back to school series, and it is really interesting to see kind of some of the results from a data perspective that are kind of moving forward. And as we think about, the year ahead, the rest of the year, let's say, so between back to school and holiday, how do you kind of think about where trends have been and where they're going? And, how do you think about some of these potentially big overhangs, like the kind of student loan, I should say, I guess, do we call it unforgiveness? What is the undoing of what are you guys calling it?
I mean, I'm waiting for you to create the right terminology, and then I'm going to copy you. And the honest truth is, I find this sometimes you're right and wrong about your expectations, but usually the process of coming to that conclusion makes itself really obvious, right? So there's times where, and then you can identify why you were wrong or right pretty easily. I actually find the back to school season to be really challenging for me, because I think we clearly still see the economic challenges. I do think there are signs of things moving in a positive direction. Like we see certain retailers, if you look at their kind of year-over-year visit gap starting to shrink, right? And we're kind of looking at late June numbers now and trying to wait for the full month to come in and see where that takes us. I think there were really positive signs with like Memorial Day, for example. Memorial Day weekend, really strong visits to like outlet malls, and in certain retailers seeing a really significant boost. So that might be a really positive indication. I think there's certain segments you feel much better about. So I think you feel really good about off-price, right? You feel really good about, kind of entertainment, affordable luxury entertainment options like movie theaters, especially with the kind of the big pictures that are expected for the summer. The rest of it, the answer is an optimistic, I don't know, right? Things seem to be moving in a good direction, but if we've learned anything, how quickly that can turn. And so that is where we stand at the moment, which is obviously the worst possible prediction. But that's what we're seeing in the data thus far.
I mean, it's interesting if we look at it purely macro, like there was this kind of, thought process around, right? SVB happened, right? We went into a mild recession in, let's call it March of this year, that we would kind of work our way through by the end. And, to date, the data does not necessarily suggest recession, but certainly, I mean, hey, when you restrict credit, I mean, if you can't get more credit, you can't buy more, right? It's just, that's why I like my job is math. So, right, and so when you start to think about that, and we've got rising interest rates, so, I think it's 13% of people who are on adjustable rate mortgage, right? They're paying more. So they have less. So if you think about kind of discretionary spending, right? We've had the elimination of a large chunk of SNAP benefits. We have had the, kind of arms reset, and we may have this unforgiveness happening in October. And so with that, right, I think people are definitely much more cautious, but they're still spending. And, we've got, over, more than full employment because, right, a lot of people have side hustles, which I think is great because I think they're then more inspired during their day job. And then you got to think about it. There's a lot of people, right, in this kind of creator economy who are not even, right, we've got really low unemployment, and there's a huge swath of people who are, kind of basically, we're not necessarily able to kind of document, if you will, their jobs, right? Because they're kind of working for themselves. And so, right, so I think that is a lot of different factors coming together, which would suggest it's going to be okay, not great. Is it a 4 to 6 versus a 2 to 4? Where does inflation kind of come into that? So are we kind of from a unit perspective negative? Probably. And, we've got some folks, not many, who've gotten over their skis on inventory, which, they all talked about it in the first quarter earnings. So I think that when we take that all kind of together and we put it in the, kind of the pot and we mix it, I think it's going to be okay. I think that what you said, which was really critical, these top tier malls, I mean, they do not have, right, they're over 100% leased. And that is phenomenon. I mean, that's just unbelievable that we're there. And, the fact that we haven't seen office kind of crash and burn as of yet, that's also, I think, a positive because there's such a negative kind of dialogue going on there right now. And Ethan, you always bring this like air of positivity, which I very much appreciate because you also bring us back to the fundamentals, right? I mean, it's like, it goes back to, right, you've got the data, we've got the math together, right? We can figure this out. And so I think as we look ahead, right, we are seeing, I think the one fly in the ointment, if you will, is around ORC. And we're seeing hesitation as we look at 24 in terms of plans for new store openings. So I would say that's like the reality, right? So we want to talk about kind of the good, the bad, and then the reality. That is the reality of things. And kind of we won't be able to kind of solve for that until we have, the folks in Washington kind of figure out how we're going to be able to manage all that from a retailer, / tenant landlord perspective, but we'll get there, right? That's the optimistic side of this. We're just not there yet.
I mean, I very much agree with that. I think there is, like, most of our optimism comes from the fact that we've seen the negative narratives and they tend to very often be exaggerated. And so the second you can accept that as like, hey, we've talked about the retail, I mean, the narrative pre-pandemic was the retail apocalypse. It was literally everything's going to be destroyed. And then we look at where we are and you kind of come to terms with the fact that, yes, there are going to be specific retailers that don't adapt and struggle, but that overall, there are challenging periods and there are periods that are less challenging. And there are opportunities for success in both. And just because it's more difficult doesn't mean there is no path to success. And sometimes also recognizing that even a difficult period, you might not do what you'd like to do, but you can still do better than like you might otherwise expect. And the example we always give is like playing quarterback in a dome versus playing quarterback on a snowy day. Like, you're not going to have the same opportunity for throw for as many yards or to have as big of a game. That doesn't mean you're playing badly. It means you're playing as well as you can.
Might be
within a
more
specific
fun,
context.
might have more fun. As somebody who's like
100%.
soccer, the best games are like in the snow, right? I mean, that was.
I think
fun.
that's how we view it overall.
All right, we have one last question that just came in. And so, Ethan, if you can answer this and then like close this out. This is actually a very good question. So seems to me the value retailers, i.e. Ross, Burlington, TJ, are doing well because people have so much more in savings than they have in historically similar situations. What do you guys think?
I think one, they are doing very well. That we certainly see. I think we less see how much from the impact of savings. What I do think there is an impact that we're also not necessarily discussing here is grabbing of visit share. So there are folks who, again, are new to the suburbs who are now being introduced to the Rosses and Burlingtons of the world in a more powerful way. And there are others that started because of the trading down and here's a value place and fell in love and are able to kind of take that added share. And I think also the wider positioning, it's a more difficult economic environment. And this is a better solution with that in mind. So I think all of these things play in, plus really smart retailers with well-placed locations and a clear sense of what they provide in store.
It is like, there's an anxiety aspect of this to me because I want to say retailers, people want to, when they come to a store, they come to buy something, they need it to be in stock. TJ, Ross, Burlington, actually Walmart does a great job of this, right? They merchandise by classification, not by brand. And so if I know, right, I know that I can go to my local, we just named a few of them, I will be able to get a pair of black pants. If I'm somewhat brand agnostic, it's okay. I'll find a great pair of pants. I will be happy with the price. I'm not taking out coupons. I'm not like feeling like the loyalty program is, kind of not taking good care of me. And so that is, I mean, to me, right? Like, I mean, hey, Ethan, this could be the, kind of Placer Coresight, right? This kind of like white paper. When you think about great retail, yes, people feel they're getting a great deal, but it's more that they, right? If you think about, this like oodles of happiness, right? These measurements, right? I'm happy. I feel satisfied from an economic perspective. If I go to the store and my time feels like it's well spent because I get what I need. So not getting too academic, but I'm happy to. But that is, I think, where, if you start to think about it, that is the like magic. And I'm like, I cover these guys as an analyst. It's just like common sense. And so, as we see more and more challenges in the retail landscape with bankruptcies and that's, it's been so interesting on the retail landscape this year, but we won't go there. Not today. But I think that they've also figured out this formula that everyone can certainly adapt for themselves. And so with that, Ethan, take us home. How do we kind of like learn more about Placer and how do we kind of get our hands on some of this great data?
Thanks, Deborah. So first of all, thank you so much. This is a pleasure as always. And if anyone's interested, just check us out at Placer.ai. We have a free version of our premium product that you can kind of test out. Also, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to tell you more. And yeah, I mean, this was great. I enjoy this so much. And thank you for having us.
Absolutely, Ethan. Always. I mean, I think this may be one of the earliest kind of peaks into back to school. But if you think about it in the US, right? I mean, we're going back pretty soon. And so, and it gets earlier and earlier every year. And it does feel like there is a lot of pent-up demand this year is what I'm hearing anecdotally. And so I think it is why some folks got a bit over their skis on inventory. So, I mean, hey, we're going to know a heck of a lot more in about 6 to 7 weeks. Yeah. And we're also seeing a big, we also believe that there'll be an even bigger uniform business this year, which I also find, I don't know why, you get those things that are like really narrow, but you get like absolutely obsessed with the data. You want to talk uniforms to me, Ethan? I will speak for hours because it's so interesting. If you look at the data over time, which I will send to you after this call, it is really absolutely fascinating. So with that, you know where to find Ethan, you know where to get your hands on this great data, and we'll kind of have slices and dices of this great conversation that we'll get out onto social media. Ethan, thank you as always, and looking forward to seeing you soon.